So welcome back, scholars, to our AME facilitated sessions. I am Dr. Darren Wayne Jackson II, your AME co-host and moderator, joined by Dr. David Leon Taylor.
Welcome back, everyone. Glad to have our scholars with us again.
Yes, our AME CEO, expert facilitator, and our co-host. So today, DT, we are rounding out our conversation on the medical college admissions test, the good old
Yes.
MCAT, right? And what we want to discuss in today's facilitated session is real techniques and teaching techniques to help students break down the MCAT. And we're going to use some actual questions and paragraphs and some questions associated with a paragraph to really reinforce some of these skills and tools that we've talked about through not only the first facilitated session with our wellness framework, but also our second facilitated session where we talked about our structure, our skills, and then the strategy. So this is where we bring everything together.
Everything's going to come together, DJ. And the key piece for our scholars to understand is, again, from the earlier facilitated session, you have to have mastered the MCAT blueprint, because now in this section, we're going to be showing how we execute on that blueprint. That's going to be very key, right? And so, again, the goal is not to memorize content for the exam, but to use your thinking skills with an understanding of key science content for the science sections. But remember, there's thinking skills for the non-science section as well, and that has nothing to do with core science content.
Right.
So it's all about the thinking skills, and let's get into applying that right now.
Right. So before we do that, let's look at the real life landscape of our
yes.
scholars out there on the what you like to call the interweb.
Yes.
So going back to our Reddit threads and our studentdoctor.net threads. So here's one from studentdoctor.net. I read the content, but I freeze when I see a real passage. Or another one, how do I approach these dense cars paragraphs? So these are real reflections from students out there preparing for the MCAT, and this is a concern. And so today we're going to give our future doctors tools, not just tips, through actual examples with looking at these paragraphs and going through the questions and linking them to the foundational tools that we talked about in our second facilitated session on the MCAT, and really kind of give our students some tools of how to be successful in the MCAT.
Absolutely. And it's combined with, again, a strategy of how we approach the structure of the exam, because, again, in the science sections, you have both passage-based questions, or there'll be a series of paragraphs that will give you some context or a story around that area of information we're attempting to have you understand and think about, right? After that series of paragraphs, or these passages that are very dense that scholars have referenced, there will be anywhere from 4 to 6 questions. Now, just structurally, again, in the science sections, you have questions that are related to the passages. There are about 44 questions, and there will be upwards of 7 to 8 passages in the section. Then there are also passage independent questions which don't relate to any series of paragraphs or discussion. It's just a core question. We're going to focus on the passage-based questions because those tend to be more challenging for scholars because they have to comprehend everything in the passage and then apply their thinking, right? And so you want to start with the first section? Which one you want to start with?
This will be, and also for our future doctors out there, a refresher course on the structure and the importance of staying the name. So let me get my practice in. So let's jump in with our first section, our first part of the exam, which is the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. Is that correct?
The biological and biochemical foundation of living systems. That is correct. That is one of the 3 science sections of the MCAT. Now, on exam day, this will be section 3 of the MCAT, just to let our scholars follow when they will encounter it, because that will be part of the strategy of the day.
Right.
But let's look at an actual concept. One concept in the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems is enzyme deficiencies related to specific pathways. Let's say it's a glucose 6-phosphate enzyme deficiency. Now, this means from a
Good old
core content
G6PD.
point of view, right, we have to know the basics of where we find that enzyme in the pentose phosphate pathway. So in essence, now that we know the core concept that we're going to be focusing on, right, and then we have to look at that pathway, what's the strategy? The strategy for this type of science section, the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, is to annotate selectively key information related to glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, and then to map that to some meaningful purpose around medicine. So as we look at the passage, what's the key areas that we should be annotating? Because we do not want to get in the habit of just highlighting or annotating all the areas, right? We want to be strategic, and then we want to map it or link it to what we anticipate will be questions that we will ask.
So this is a very active process. So
Very
what you're
active,
doing
yes.
is you're turning, reading into action. And basically you are annotating, you're sketching, but then you're connecting these concepts, and then you're testing yourself in real time.
That is correct. And remember, this is linked back to your earlier practice and understanding of the MCAT blueprint. So this process has to be efficient because some scholars are not as efficient with their time or selective in what they annotate because they have not practiced the blueprint, which starts with, okay, the concept is glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase.
Right.
All right, let's start with skill 1. Remember, there are 4 scientific reasoning and inquiry skills. Skill 1 is knowledge of scientific concepts and principles. What's my knowledge of this enzyme? What's its role in the pathway? See that? So I should have done that piece already. 2, scientific reasoning and problem solving. I should have already practiced before I get to this passage when I first learned the concept. All right, what happens if this enzyme is deficient? What happens if it's overactive, etc.? What's going on with that particular enzyme? Where would I have to actually problem solve about it? That's skill 2. Skill 3, remember? So design, remember that? Design and execution around research, right? So what if they give me this information in a research passage or a research story? How do I begin to understand the information? And then skill 4, which was data-based and statistical reasoning, what if they were to give me a chart, a graph, or some other data or stat-related context where I have to make an interpretation of what's happening with this enzyme? If I did that in my review work,
Right.
now when I come to these passages, I'm ready to actively practice which one of those 4 skills or a combination of skills will appear in the 4 to 6 questions that are going to follow the passage.
And like you say, the more you practice that, the more you develop that tool and that skill, and we get into slice and dice mode where we get that question. So let's jump in and look at an actual passage from the biological and biochemical foundations. So a 14-year-old male presents with fatigue, pallor, and jaundice following a bout of influenza. Laboratory studies reveal anemia and elevated levels of unconjugated bilirubin.
Let's stop there for a second. So one of the things I always say to scholars is after you read 1 or 2 sentences, in thinking what you just read, is there anything important that I might want to pick out? And so the first thing I would do, yes, we know from what you talked about earlier in terms of epidemiology, that's always important. Okay, so I have a young person, 14, and if I know I'm in the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, they love to do enzyme deficiencies at a younger age where we see these metabolic concerns. So I'll look at that. Yes, I see there's some sequelae here, fatigue, pallor, and jaundice. Okay, I have that. But I want to note very quickly, there was this discussion about anemia. And as soon as I think about anemia and remember the way our brain works, I can already see before you finish that first paragraph, I see deficiency in glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. So with that alone, I already, based on remember my review going across those 4 skills, I have an idea where this is going. I'm like, oh, it's a glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. I know that means that we do not have an opportunity to have these reduction of the hemoglobin membrane, right? Because of glutathione, et cetera.
Safeguards for
That's
oxidative
right.
stress. Yeah.
Exactly. So now I get the red blood cells being attacked. I got anemia. So that explains potentially why we may have some fatigue. So right there, you can immediately, by just looking at the frame of that paragraph, get a sense of where it's going. That's my takeaway. That's what I mean by strategic annotation. But then also, how do you map it in your brain to what's going on? It's very active and it's very aggressive. It's not like a walk in the park. You are actively engaged in this.
You're doing this very
attack.
fast in
That's
real
correct.
time.
So quite frankly, at that point, when I see you could continue reading, but I have an idea where this first paragraph is going. So I always say to scholars, make sure you don't read beyond 2 sentences before you say anything I should take away from that.
Gotcha.
Continue.
All right. Further testing shows an increased level of reticulocytes and the presence of Heinz bodies on a peripheral blood smear. The physician suspects a deficiency of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, G6PD.
All right, so we've already kind of made an assessment of that first paragraph. Let's go to the second one and see what comes up.
Gotcha. G6PD is an enzyme in the pentose phosphate pathway which produces NADPH. NADPH is critical for regenerating reduced glutathione.
Let's stop there. So earlier on, when we were doing our reflection for the first paragraph, and I mentioned in your reading frame, you already see glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. This is where efficiency comes in with initial preparation. If we've done that review before, and I'm very confident on my understanding of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, this second paragraph is just reinforcing what I already know. It's reinforcing the process. So I can begin to move through that even faster, scanning it to see, is there anything new that I'm being given? This is why preparation is so key with understanding. Just memorizing where the enzyme is not going to help me, but understanding its role allows me to attack this passage because I have to be mindful of my timing strategy as well.
Right.
So now an overlaid strategy is, as I'm reading and I process after 2 sentences, I can now move a little bit faster and scan because there may be information I already know and understand. In a separate session, usually in one of our online courses, we will discuss what happens when I don't recall this information.
Right.
That's a whole nother conversation, and we need to have much more deep dive time to do that. And so we invite our scholars to consider our online course where we master the MCAT blueprint and we do deep dives to give you multiple strategies of attack.
Gotcha.
However, for this session, we are making a reasonable consideration that our scholars have followed the MCAT blueprint. They have done that work.
And mastered it.
And if you master that, you can attack it like we're doing right now.
Right.
If we haven't, we need to do a deeper dive class that really understands how to look at multiple ways to approach these passages when I have strengths in my understanding and when I have areas of improvement. That'll be beyond this session, right? But I just wanted to point that out because that's what's happening. That's why preparation is so key beforehand, but preparation with understanding, practicing, thinking, not simply memorization.
Right.
Or you're going to run into a lot of problems.
Because a student might get to this second paragraph and see something that they may not have been familiar with their content review, and then go into that automatic panic mode of, okay,
Correct.
I don't know this, based off of just,
Correct.
just something that they might have seen in this second paragraph.
So one scholar may have that,
Yeah.
and that would be a challenge for that scholar. Another scholar who may not remember this, but who actually remains calm and has excellent reading comprehension, this information now is golden because it's giving them the information they're going to need potentially to answer questions later.
Right.
So that's what we call differentiated learning based on our core skills and how well those skills are. And this is what we also tease out in a one-on-one session, when you're trying to coach scholars, we evaluate, well, do you have excellent comprehension skills? Because that skill set is an asset if you don't recall certain information, because the passage may give you the information you need. On the other hand, if I don't recall certain information and I do not have a strong comprehension skill, this doesn't help me, it panics me.
Right. But then you have your other skills that you'll
That
get
is
in
correct.
our more deep dive one-on-one sessions that can get you to the right answer despite feeling like you don't know this
Exactly.
particular
So I wanted to
aspect.
highlight that in this moment, one of the ways you optimally prepare for the MCAT is to have 5 layers of strategy.
Gotcha.
5 layers of strategy that we practice. So when things are well, top layer, we roll right through. When things are challenging, I have 4 other layers to attack this in an efficient time frame and then exit.
Exit.
And the number one challenge, and we heard it with the scholars, when these passages are dense and you do not have a key strategy you practice or a series of strategies, you lose time and you lose points.
Right.
And then the saboteur is ready to come in and say,
that's
whoa,
key.
you're in the problem, aren't you?
Exit.
That's right.
That's key. Exit. You told me all the time. One time I'm taking the board, you said write on your paper, time to get out.
That's
You
right.
know?
Time to get out. You must have an
Move on,
exit strategy,
an exit
because there'll be
strategy.
other questions for which you have assets that you can be successful on, and we do not want to lose that opportunity.
Right.
So a lot of times we need to have a lot more mentorship to have mastery in how we execute exam day strategies. And this type of passage, only 2 paragraphs in, is giving us a great way to kind of model that for our scholars. It's not just one strategy, it's a combination of effort, and you have to practice it, and that takes work.
Right. So let's jump back into the question.
Yeah, let's
So-
go into the 3rd paragraph.
So the 3rd paragraph, gotcha. So the pentose phosphate pathway starts with glucose 6-phosphate and produces ribose 5-phosphate, a precursor for nucleotide synthesis, as well as NADPH. The pathway operates alongside glycolysis in cells and is especially active in cells exposed to high levels of reactive oxygen species.
Right. So again, it's actually going back to what we noted in the very first paragraph of the frame, that in essence, one of the actual roles of glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, when we have excess glucose, of course, the glucose is being moved from a 6-carbon sugar to a 5-carbon sugar for ribonucleic acid synthesis, right? So that's why it's called the pentose phosphate pathway.
I remember that path.
That's
that
right. But in the
pathway.
process, because we are removing that energy, we reduce NADP to NADPH, and NADPH is used for reductive biosynthesis.
Gotcha.
So it can keep, for example, glutathione reduced, which helps protect the red blood cell membrane. So all that is part of our understanding. What's happening here in paragraphs 2 and 3 is really a summary of that entire process if we're familiar with it. So we could be aggressive, move through this passage, and now get ready to attack our question.
Question 1. Let's read the first question that's associated with this passage.
All right?
All right.
Let's see what's going on.
Question 1. Which best explains Heinz bodies in this patient's RBCs?
Interesting. So again, now let's look at attacking the question. There's a key context right here, Heinz bodies, and notice the word explain. So right there, we know that we are assessing the thinking skill, number 2, scientific reasoning, problem solving, because we're trying to connect Heinz bodies to what's happening with the red blood cells. Now, we already recall from the passage, this is why it's important when we're reading the passage, not to try to go back and forth,
Right.
that takes time, but to actually comprehend or understand while we're reading with that selective annotation and mapping, right? So we already mapped the fact that, oh, they said there was going to be this enzyme deficiency, and with that deficiency, we know the red blood cells, unfortunately, are going to be subject to oxidizing agents, right? And so as a result, we saw in the blood smear these Heinz bodies, which are red blood cells. So we must map Heinz bodies to something that is going to suggest we are not protecting the red blood cell, right?
Right.
So when we look at the options here, right, Look at A.
Option
So
A,
denatured
denatured
hemoglobin due to decrease in NADPH. Well, first of all, we know that decrease in NADPH is the key because when there is an enzyme deficiency, we cannot reduce NADP to NADPH. So as a result of that, we know that we don't have a reducing agent for the red blood cell membrane with the glutathione. So yes, we could denature hemoglobin because that's what happened, is subject to oxidizing species, right? Oxidizing free radicals. So that therefore becomes a priority option. However, testing strategy says we need to go through all the other options, but again, it's based on our understanding, right? There's integration here. So the highest degree of confidence is when we can impeach all other options.
Right.
So far, option A is an
Seems
option
reasonable.
we are considering, right? So we'll keep that as a little check mark, right?
Right.
Option B, overproduction of ribose 5-phosphate. Well, I love to say with those options, get out of here. That's the end product in the pathway, so you have to understand the pathway. We have an enzyme deficiency at the beginning of the pathway. So that's out, right? Inhibition of glycolysis. First of all, we understand that ribose, the pentose phosphate pathway is upregulated when we have what? When we usually have a high level of glycolysis occurring, or we have a high level of glucose already in the system. So glycolysis is not necessarily inhibited. Glycolysis is downregulated, relatively speaking, when the pentose phosphate pathway is upregulated.
Right.
But let's not even take that. Let's go back to what is the question?
Right.
The question is, does that have anything to do with the Heinz bodies? The answer is no. So that's out. So you can take the least amount of information,
Right.
the least amount of information with thinking and testing skill to optimize the correct choice or impeach an option. Inhibition of glycolysis has nothing to do with the Heinz bodies once we understand that the Heinz bodies are a result of what has happened to the red blood cell due to the decrease in NADPH due to the enzyme deficiency, right?
Yeah.
So you can begin to quickly impeach options. Again, let's look at option D, increase oxidative phosphorylation. Well, increased oxidative phosphorylation is occurring from the perspective that we have a lot of glucose around the system, and eventually that'll be broken down and you'll have some oxidative phosphorylation going on. But again, what does that have to do with the Heinz bodies, which goes back to what's creating that context, and that has to do with the decrease in NADPH. So again, you can impeach based on that. What's a problem here that some scholars have is when you think about the pentose phosphate pathway, and that pathway is upregulated, that means that we have excess glucose that's available now to be oxidized, where we can capture its energy to produce NADPH. NADPH has a role, but also we can have the end product of a pentose phosphate pathway. All that's going on. But because that's going on, you have excess glucose, you also know that you have that glucose being broken down and there is oxidative phosphorylation going on later on to capture that energy. So it's actually a true statement that there is a lot of oxidative phosphorylation going on, but it doesn't answer the question.
That's not the reason for Heinz bodies.
Exactly. And so a scholar who does not use a testing skill to understand what is the question, they're asking about Heinz bodies. When you leave the focus of the question, you may see an option and say, oh yeah, that's true, because this would be happening so and so forth. And so that maybe I'll select that. No, got to be very careful.
So if we're linking this strategy that we just did with this first paragraph to, you know, our thinking skills that we
Yes.
talked about in our second facilitated session around the MCAT, how does this link to the the testing competencies or the skill learning competencies that the AAMC wants us to understand?
Let's go to the explanation and take a look at that. So each question, as we said, is mapped back to, in the science sections, a foundational concept and to a thinking skill. The foundational concept here is 1B. So in the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, there are 3 foundational concepts. And then each of those foundational concepts has a subdomain. It could be 1A, 1B, 1C. So The free resource on the AAMC website, and we'll be talking about that at the end, actually shares all the information you need to know about the foundational concepts for the science sections, which represent the areas of information we want you to understand in the sciences, for which you will then do advanced thinking. And so every question from any of the science sections, here we're in the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, will have a foundational concept, and then there'll be a skill. Skill 2 is scientific reasoning and problem solving. Do we understand the process of what happens with glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, and can we link that to some key context? In this case, it was the Heinz bodies, right? And here we have the explanation that shows that entire process, right?
Wow.
So this is a great example also of error analysis. If I scored the question incorrect in any of the science sections, did I score the question incorrect because I didn't understand the foundational concept, 1B, either the facts or the relationship of the facts? Did I miss the question because of the actual skill, the thinking skill? Or was it a testing skills issue where I referenced a moment ago, I just lost focus of the question and just looked only at the option by itself? That looked like a true answer, but the answer must map back to what is the question.
It's a lot of cognitive switchboarding going on because
A lot.
you're looping between skills and competencies. And then, of course, we talked about the critical analysis and reasoning section, which has its own set of learning skills.
I love the way you said there's a lot of cognitive switchboarding going on, going back and forth. Because what it means is if I have not mastered that blueprint, and I know we keep going back to it, but if we have not mastered the blueprint
Before the exam.
that's right, before the exam, before you're even studying, if we have not mastered that blueprint, it is very difficult to do this process. And that's one of the challenges for a lot of scholars, because the prep programs are not focused on the blueprint. The prep programs assume you know the blueprint. They assume you can actually think. Prep programs are primarily focused on content review. Content review.
And that can be a kind of red herring for some students, because if you think that just doing this particular QBank or this particular online resource is going to give you that the skills, the competencies in understanding that blueprint, that's not going, because as we talked about the switchboarding and trying to do that in real time. Let's just say you haven't practiced this. Let's just say you haven't even covered the blueprint before, this is after your dedicated period. You're actually on exam day. Imagine having to do all of this cognitive switchboarding in real time when it actually matters on game day.
Right. And what happens with those scholars when you're trying to do that? You lose a lot of time. You all of a sudden you find near the end of the section, you haven't done 3 passages. You're missing anywhere from 6 to 12 questions, right? And now you're concerned and you just start guessing. Right. And that's where we get, unfortunately, not a very good score. So this has been a great sort of start with the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems to highlight not only a strategy specific for this section, but to also underscore the key foundational concepts and skills related to science sections, and why the blueprint is so important as part of your anchor when you are practicing passages and questions, because it requires that you have done that work beforehand. If you just think you can practice a lot of questions and do well on the MCAT, you are mistaken, because you don't know the blueprint.
Right.
So you're at a significant disadvantage. And as you said, you cannot do the level of cognitive switching that's required to be successful.
You want to take another question, or you want to go into our second section?
Great point. Let's just take a peek very quickly at some of the other questions, just to highlight them. Which pathway is most directly impaired in this patient? So that requires us, of course, to remember that this is the pentose phosphate pathway that is associated in this particular context, right? So notice that they give you again the concept and the skill 1, that's mostly a recall question and then basic understanding. So skill 1 is knowledge of scientific principles and concepts. You got to know what pathway you're talking about,
Right.
but they also told you in the passage. Wasn't that interesting? So, and then here in the next question here, we get a little bit more rigor if a drug increases in a DPH. So the first thing we've done is we've given you a new situation. Now we're getting to advanced thinking.
Yeah.
See that? That's some advanced thinking. So now we have to truly understand what's happening to be able to answer this question. And we'll see in a moment that, again, it's still skill 4 here from a research perspective, right? But it's more when they say database, the database and statistical reasoning, which is skill 4, where they're going with this one is that they've given you a scenario that relates to a drug context.
Right.
Now, that doesn't seem like data, but what they've done is focused you on a situation that we can then measure some sort of data or stat outcome. So data or statistics doesn't always come as a chart or a graph, etc. It can come in what I call proxy language of a situation that then we can ultimately quantify, right?
Gotcha.
So that's why this one is focused on skill 4 here, right? We see skill 4, but it's the foundational concept to be to understand. So again, you can begin to see a range of questions with these passages. Notice so far there was skill 1, there was skill 2, there was skill 4, and that was 3 of the questions. Passages can have 4 to 6 questions. So they're going to get all 4 skills in some way most of the time. Just like we said in the blueprint, I think we need to practice, because if we don't practice each one of those skills, you see what the challenge is.
Yeah.
If I can only do Anki and recall information, I'll get the question that's skill 1. What's the pathway?
Right.
Oh, yeah, I can tell you that, but I can't answer those other questions, right? And then look here, skill 4, look right there, experiment. As soon as we see experiment, what are we thinking? That's skill 3. That is our research, right? That is design and reasoning around the execution of research, right? There it is, experiment, right? So again, all of these, and here is skill 3 right there, right? And then foundational concept 1C. So notice they're going across different foundational concepts around this in terms of its foundational concept 1 is a 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, but then we can go on across all 4 skills. 4 questions and all 4 skills were represented. Isn't that something?
That's something.
So this is the level of practice again. When we are practicing the passages, now with the error analysis, we must do this type of review to truly appreciate, wow, they're actually going to ask me all 4 skills. Wow,
they will.
I know what areas to focus on in terms of the foundational concepts. I'm trying to figure out, where should I study? Okay, we tell you the foundational concepts, but don't just memorize them, understand them, because you're going to have to apply it. And again, if you don't know the MCAT blueprint, this is a foreign language. This is a foreign language. And you're missing the best part of your success, which is knowing how to execute on the blueprint. That's how the exam is designed. And as I would say, if I know you're going to ask me the questions this way, wouldn't I study that way?
It would
Wouldn't I study
be the
that
smartest approach, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that brings us to our second section. Let's look at chemical and physical foundations of biological systems.
So you're having fun with the full names.
Yes,
of the
yes.
sections.
This is our practice, right? Hope our future doctors at home practicing as well. So in this section, from what I can remember back to the MCAT, the physics, the chemistry, there's a lot of equations, and they can be extremely daunting.
Yes.
So what are your approaches around, this equation heavy section of the exam?
So our scholars are on point when they say, I have to know the equations. That is a big yes.
Right.
You need to know the equations. So we should have a strategy for practicing the equations each day. And congratulations, if you're using a flashcard resource such as Anki or other, it will serve that purpose for you to know the equation. All right. 2, our scholars will say, okay, once I know the equation, I need to be able to do basic calculations. Another big check, yes. And again, now your Anki can't do that plug and chug for you, but you should be obviously ready to know what values I plug into what variables. Now, that starts moving you toward understanding, and here's where more work comes in. Because simply knowing the equation and being able to put in values to calculate an outcome, that's skill one. That's knowledge of scientific principles and concepts. There won't be a lot of questions like that, but there will be at least one question per passage in this section whenever you have formulas and equations. So we're going to get at least one question right. So yes, we need to know that, but we need to also understand the relevance of these formulas again to a real world situation. So let's take a step back and understand that mathematical formulas are a way to quantify concepts that we understand. Mathematical formulas are a way to quantify concepts that we understand. Let's go back to one of your favorites, which is Ohm's law. So we know the
Nerve
law.
cell membrane.
That's right.
How does when we're looking at Ohm's law and the nerve cell membrane, how do we approach the calculations and resistance and current? What are we doing?
So the Ohm's law, first we need to know the formula, which is
Write out I equals VR.
I equals VR or V equals IR?
V equals IR.
V equals IR.
You
Exactly.
put me on the spot.
That's
V
right. We were
equals
just having fun with it, right? V equals IR. So V equals IR, and that's great. We know the formula, but now do we understand what that's representing? So we need to also understand those variables that V, voltage, is representative of the charge differential that is typically occurring across the membrane, right? The biological membrane. And we can measure that charge differential in voltage, right? Then the I represents the current. The current is movement of charged particles. So when those charged particles are moving, they create a current. If we were to put a probe in there to measure the value or quantify that current, that would be the voltage. R, the resistance. Remember, these charged particles are moving through a biological membrane, which is comprised mostly of lipid. It's a lipid bilayer. Charges and fat don't mix well together. As you know, we have channels in other areas of the membrane for charged particles to move. So there will be some encountering of resistance. So that's big picture to understand the formula. But now we go one step further, that this entire Ohm's law helps us understand, in essence, what we call electrical potentials. Charge differences across the membrane, and those charge differences across the membrane are forms of cell-to-cell communication, and they play a vital role in biological systems. Chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. That's the understanding we want to have beyond, I know the formula, I can write it out, and I can put a number in and get an outcome. That will get me one question correct. Everything we just talked about takes us up the other three skills, skill 2, skill 3, and skill 4, that are part of the scientific inquiry and reasoning skills, right?
And I think one, very important thing to mention is, as we continue through our prep, time for the MCAT, we want to practice refining our extrapolation of the data. So say we have a passage with tables and statistics, and what we want to do is practice that data translation. But in that practicing of the data translation, we want to work on being able to explain it as in plain English as possible. If I'm able to teach you this, we get so caught up as students looking at the most, intellectual and academic way to break this process or system down, when we really should be finding out, extrapolating that information from the vignette and then figuring out a way to translate it into our minds, into the most plain English that we can possibly understand, that gives us all of the competencies to answer that question correctly.
Exactly. That gives you the confidence and the understanding, because now you've been able to break that core concept down to meaningful parts where you actually can tell a story, which is the important strategy for when we have these formulas. The strategy is, am I able to map the formula to some meaningful story or situation? We're going to map the formula of Ohm's law to membrane potentials across a cell, to electrical activity that allows for other biological function. And it depends where we are, because if we were in the brain, the electrical activity is allowing for cell-to-cell communication, so neuronal cell-to-cell communication. If I'm in the musculoskeletal system, then that is neuromuscular junction, where we have electrical potentials occurring right in that process. If we were back in the heart, as we said earlier, the cardiovascular system, that's for heart rate and ultimately heart contraction. So again, chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, we just map Ohm's law to 3 different biological systems. That's the type of practice it takes. In addition to looking at the 4 different skills, we can change the situation. This is why again we have to understand, and we cannot memorize information. All right, DJ, so let's take a look now at a question in the chemical and physical foundations. Again, we have a short passage. Why don't you go ahead and read that passage?
All right, let me start off. A neuroscientist is studying the electrical properties of a nerve cell membrane. She prepares 2 types of artificial membranes.
Oh, let's stop there. So the first piece we notice, of course, is that we're thinking about electrical properties. And so already primed for, in essence, membrane potentials across what type of cell? A nerve cell. So we have some core understanding of that already. But here's something that's very important. We're told that the investigator is going to create artificial membrane cells.
That's that concept.
Now, that's important, right?
Concept 3, because she's setting up and research.
Correct. Research, that is correct. That's correct. It's reasoning about the design and execution of research, skill 3. What it also means is we must now adapt our thinking about membranes to the artificial membrane versus the normal membrane that we are used to thinking through, because we have to work with the context that's being given. So we got to be a little careful because she's preparing 2 types of artificial membrane cells. So these membranes may operate differently. So again, this understanding of, first, what is the understanding of a core biological membrane, right? We understand that. And going through, of course, the different levels of thinking. Remember, we're in chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. So the biological component is the nervous system. So we're looking at a nerve membrane. However, we're looking at chemical and physical properties. So we know we're going to be moving there next. And that's why when we glance, we see this sodium-potassium channels. But I wanted to alert us of this because in artificial settings, sometimes they change the way the ions normally function to have us think through what would be the impact on biologic function.
And you foreshadow, because that's exactly what happens. It says in one with a normal sodium and potassium channel, and then the other artificial membrane has the potassium channels blocked.
There it is.
Right.
There it is.
That's the
See?
the scenario that was
Correct.
created in this skill 3 that we have to know.
That's right. And it's very interesting that, okay, we have 2 membranes, and of course they've been made up artificially, but one is made normally like we would see it. The other one, something is blocked.
Potassium
And this is the
channels,
classic context of research where we change things to look at the effects so we can then have remedies, right? Develop remedies. This is a forerunner of medical innovation through research for medical intervention and new novel therapies. Interesting, isn't it?
Right.
Let's continue.
So here we're bringing back this voltage clamp. So you'll always, you'll
right.
continue
You
to hear this
can't run
voltage.
away
You can't
from
run
it.
away from this voltage clamp experiment. But a voltage clamp shows for the normal cells a voltage of 70 millivolts and a total ionic current of 7 microamps. For potassium blocked cells, the voltage is 120 millivolts and current is 3 microamps. The relationship between voltage on the y-axis and total current on the x-axis is linear for both.
Interesting. So first of all, this intimates that we're going to have a graph somewhere, but without even seeing the graph, we have an understanding of what's happening between voltage and current, that there's a linear relationship, which is interesting, right? In terms of how it's being applied here. The other piece that we note is that we have some quantitative data now being provided to us in this sort of research passage. So let's see how this comes out in the questions. But in essence, what happens here when you're annotating or trying to map this type of question, right, from the passage, or map the content from the passage to the question, we know that Ohm's law is going to be playing a role here somewhere.
Right.
But we have to think through, okay, you gave me a normal cell and one that's blocked. There's probably going to be a change in the physical and chemical properties because we blocked the potassium channel.
Right.
So I need to prepare my thinking for that. You see? So we don't have to do any additional annotation. We get some information about what happens when we do the voltage clamp, and we could make some interpretation from that.
Right.
But let's see if that's necessary as a matter of strategy.
Right, because I might have already started to go in based off of not seeing a graph, but knowing that there was a linear relationship for between the voltage on the X and total currents on the Y-axis. We saw that it was linear for both, right?
Right.
And so the student might fall into the trap of starting a cognitive rabbit hole of what
absolutely.
that information means. But like you said, we might not even need it. So let's read question 1.
Let's see what's
What
happening.
is resistance of membrane with normal channels?
So-
5.
So let's stop there.
Okay.
What is the resistance of membrane with normal channels? So we have 2 normal channels and we have the resistance. So clearly we're doing a calculation. That's Ohm's law. And remember, in the passage, we were given data.
Right.
Right? We were given data that will allow us to calculate the resistance. So this is a straightforward level 1 skill question, which is knowledge, right? Knowledge of scientific principles and concepts. Do I know Ohm's law, and can I calculate it if you give me the data, right?
We kind of call this like a plug and chug type of question.
Exactly. Because remember, we were given the voltage,
Right.
and we were given the current, so we can calculate the resistance. And we were also told about linear relationships, but I don't need that to answer this question.
Right?
So I already knew when you practice enough of these passages, and that's the key in the practice, you're like, okay, you give me some data, great. I'm probably going to use that at some point. I don't need to annotate that, but I've logged it that I may need to use that because I understand the underpinning here is Ohm's law. And if you want to give me a gift, you'll give me a level 1, skill 1 question where I can do some calculation. But be careful. We need to calculate it for which membrane? Which channel? The normal channel.
Normal channel.
That's for the normal membrane. If you calculate it for the other one, that answer is here, and that would be a testing skill error.
Exactly.
Because you didn't read it's for the normal channel, not for the abnormal one.
So when you do your error analysis, if that became an issue and you got that question wrong because of that testing error, you then paying attention and being very intentional about your timing when you're practicing. You don't want to go and do a whole content review of the Ohm's law.
You don't need to.
Yeah.
You don't need to because the issue wasn't content. You understand Ohm's law.
Right.
You know what Ohm's law is? You actually know how to, you know the formula? You know how to put the
Manipulate the
data
formula.
into the formula. What happened was you misread the question and it said the normal channel, but you used the data for the other channel.
potassium
So remember,
block
there is a artificial membrane with normal distribution of sodium potassium, and then there's an artificial membrane where the potassium is blocked. That channel, right? So that's the abnormal channel.
Right. Yeah. So let's
That's
look at
right.
let's
So
look at
that's a great point you just made. So
yeah.
when we're doing error analysis, remember we said before, the error could be related to knowledge. Then it's going to be the foundational concept. The error could be related to thinking. Then you have to practice the thinking skill. But the error could have nothing to do with your thinking or your knowledge. It could be you had a testing skill miscue. And the miscue would be misreading and then using the wrong data associated with the label in this case.
Right. Missing that qualifier in the vignette.
That's right, the normal channel.
Yeah. That
That's
takes
right,
you
exactly
to the
right.
wrong data in the vignette, which then gives you the wrong calculation. Right.
Exactly. So here we see very clearly that's going to be a skill 1, and then 4B, of course, maps back to potentials related to Ohm's law, etc. Right?
Right.
Now, by the way, in the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, that first section we did, those relate to foundational concepts 1 through 3. That's why we'll see 1A, 1B, or 2A, 2B, right, etc. In the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, the foundational concepts are 4 and 5. So we may see 4A, 4B, 4C, or 5A, 5B, 5C. I got to also know the blueprint. That's why that says 4B, because in the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, it's only 2 foundational concepts we're focused on, number 4 and number 5. And so our scholars, that is your homework in advance as part of the blueprint. You don't know that, then you have no idea what this is talking about, right? Okay, let's go to the next question, see what's going on. Ooh, look at this. We start with blocking potassium channels.
And so what this has an effect, what effect on the resistance and why? So if we're blocking the potassium channels, this has an effect on resistance and why.
Right. Now look what happened here. There's no quantitative data.
Up, down arrows.
That's right, up, down arrows. So this can be a thinking question. This is definitely going to be minimally skill 2 because we have to reason and problem solve. And as we know, one of the testing strategies is if I have a common term like here, resistance, I may be able to impeach some of these options because the resistance has to be going in one direction or the other. So what if we were to think this through? If you block a channel, it says block the potassium channel, so we're blocking ion flow.
Right.
If you're blocking ion flow, well, would there be a resistance to that flow? I mean, you're blocking the channel. So does the resistance go up? Now, look at this, though. It says, what effect on the resistance? Is that the resistance for the channel or the resistance for the membrane?
I think it's talking about the overall membrane, because if we're talking about blocking the channel and it's asking about resistance, what effect does it have on resistance for the system, you know, from what it's seeming like, and then why it would make sense that if you continue to block ways in which ions can move and traverse the cellular membrane, you increase resistance.
That's right, because there's no way to get through the membrane, right? Because the channel, going back to our core understanding of biological membranes, lipid bilayer, is we have these protein channels that provide opportunities for ions to go through, right? But there's resistance because there'll be a certain number of channels that may be available at any time. So therefore, we know we should expect that resistance will go up, which means we can impeach option D and we can impeach option B. So by understanding the core principle of Ohm's law, but it's not just Ohm's law, it's understanding Ohm's law ion movement in the biological membrane. Isn't that interesting? It's understanding it within the membrane. That's the key. So understanding allows us to be aggressive in our impeachment. Okay, so now we have only 2 options left. It's either going to be with increased resistance because we have fewer pathways, or an increased resistance, does voltage drop? Interesting. Which one? Which one do you think we're going to be working with here?
Well, I think we're going to work with fewer pathways because, you know, just off of this is one that I would kind of not get too in the weeds of science because, you know, in theory, it just makes sense that when you know, the path of least resistance, you know, when you're talking about closing off ways in which an ion can traverse the membrane.
The least amount of information
Yeah.
with thinking and testing skill is what you just illustrated.
Yeah, because I was about to go
It
on
does
and on.
not require, right? It does not
Yeah.
require, as you said, but you're hitting the same point. It was
Right.
very good. It does not require a deep dive into, my goodness, I wonder what's happening with voltage. Do I need to go back and compare the voltages, etc.? Based on your understanding, which you stated earlier, you said, well, wait a minute. If I remove a channel, which is removing a pathway,
All right.
to get through the membrane, okay, well, now there's going to be more resistance. There are less pathways. But by virtue of you saying that, you already said fewer pathways.
Mm-hmm.
You already said it in your thinking. That's what happens when we have true understanding. So we'd be expecting with a high level of confidence that the answer is going to be A.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to figure out if you're going to be rewarded in that process. The answer is A, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be skill 2, that's scientific reasoning and problem solving. And I can see, just like any scholar, you have a smile on your face.
Yes.
Woo, I got it right. I got it right. It's a good feeling, scholars, when you can practice your thinking and map it to the skills, right? So let's again, very quickly, we're not going to have time to go through all of the questions, but let's just look at, again, just briefly, question 3. Look at this. We replace a sodium ion with a cation. A cation is another positively charged ion. And notice they say the same charge, so that means it's going to be a univalent cation. However, it has half mobility. Very interesting. Effect on current. So notice how we give you conditions in this particular question. A lot of great thinking going on in this particular question to then have you assess what, again, will happen with movement. Right. All this is Ohm's law. What's happening with current? What's happening with ions, right? And so we'll see this is skill 3, which is in essence a proxy for reasoning around design and execution of research, because I gave you multiple scenarios. Sometimes we don't have to give you a detailed passage describing an experiment to create in the question itself a research context. That's why it's skill 3, because I gave you multiple conditions to consider as to what would change with current or flow, right? And then, of course, the category there is foundational concept 4A. But look again at what we're doing with the skills. We are moving up the skills. The first question was skill 1. Let's do a calculation. The second question was skill 2, right? Let's now problem solve. The third question is skill 3. Now you have this different conditions. That's like research.
Right.
A lot of application, and we probably expect that last question ultimately to go to skill 4, which we will see in a moment. And yes, it does. Look at that. So again, there are going to be opportunities to go through all 4 skill levels in these passage-based questions, and we are only providing the minimal number, which is typically 4. It can be up to 6 questions per passage. Interesting, right?
Very interesting.
Are we ready for our next section?
Let's jump into our next section.
All right.
All right.